What's up, everybody? Thanks for clicking this video. Thanks for tuning into my channel. My name is Simon Hill, Black American from Louisiana, coming to you live from Budapest, Hungary. Today is March 27th, 2025, about 8:30 p.m. where I'm at right now. And we are continuing, picking up where we left off on Slave Breeding by Gregory D. Smithers, Sex, Violence, and Memory in African American History. This book has probably been the longest one that I've been trying to complete on the Book React series, where I read a book from cover to cover on Livestream and chat it up with the people. And it's because I've been so busy with everything else, working multiple jobs, writing for culturalist theory, going to university, trying to be a husband, bouncing everywhere around here in Budapest, keeping some sort of social life and all that sort of stuff. So sorry I haven't been up here reading every day, doing the live streams like I said I would do or try to do. But I'm going to continue to try to live stream. Go check out the other content we're uploading to this channel, all the movie reviews Acti and I are doing, the reporting that I'm doing on the protests that are happening here in Budapest in relation to the events happening in Turkey, where there's backsliding in democracy, and several other things. I hope to continue to upload on this channel and keep it live, keep it trill, and keep it real all the time. So the reason why we haven't finished this book yet is partly because of the busy schedule, but also because I've been having some issues with the live streams for some reason on YouTube. I don't know if YouTube is trying to shadow ban your boy. I don't know if we're having technical difficulties because of my internet. I don't know what exactly it is, but we were actually supposed to finish the second to last chapter in our last live stream, but we didn't get to do it. We didn't get to do it. I don't know why. So it cut off right when I was jumping into this chapter, chapter 6, Sex, Violence, and the Quest for Civil Rights. In the previous chapter, I read it twice. I read it first time on live stream, but it cut off. And I read it again for everybody to hear. So go check out the previous live stream I did, because that chapter was very important. This book here is not a play-by-play retelling of the events of slave breeding as it happened in the antebellum South. This book is about how slave breeding has been remembered by various people that are, pro-Black liberation and people that are anti-Black liberation, right? And so the chapter 5 was interviews of Black people done by the WPA, which I believe was a government organization in the mid-20th century in the United States that was interviewing formerly enslaved people about their experiences of being enslaved. And many of the enslaved people were talking about, yeah, my father was a breeder, my mama was a breeder, I was a breeder, stuff like that. And I felt like that was a very important chapter because it's very rare, first and foremost, to hear the voices of the formerly enslaved in literature, right? Because so many of them had their stories erased or never became literate and couldn't write their own stories, etc. And secondly, I think for all of the stories that are told in this book about how slave breeding has been remembered, the people that went through it are the ones that should be highlighted the most, right? In my opinion, chapter 5 of this book should have been the very first chapter. But we're going to continue reading here, and we're starting in chapter 6, Sex, Violence, and the Quest for Civil Rights. And we're just going to jump in right now. In Slavery and in Freedom, the historian Daniel McGuire argues sexual and racial violence functioned as a tool of coercion, control, and harassment. African American women understood this basic fact of American history better than most. The constant threat of rape that followed Black women in slavery and the incidences of sexual violence, kidnapping, and sexual assault after slavery ultimately inspired the civil rights movement. In the popular imagination, the civil rights movement began with the Montgomery bus boycott during 1955 and 1956. In actuality, the movement was the culmination of decades, actually centuries, of interracial sexual violence that affected the lives of Black women, men, and their families. The civil rights movement was the product of militant race women like Rosa Parks saying enough to the sexual and racial abuses experienced by Black women and their families. They were determined to challenge white America to live up to the democratic ideals it proclaimed to be fighting for during World War II. Black women like Parks, politically determined, race-proud, and intellectually brilliant, began a movement for African American civil rights in the 1940s. For multiple generations of African American women since the Civil War, the cult of dissemblance had meant that stories of sexual violence were hushed or kept strictly within close family circles. The objective of such circumstances, as Darlene Clark Hine observes, was to shield Black women from the racial and sexual taunts of white America and to project a dignified countenance to the outside world. But as we have seen in the previous chapters, maintaining hushed tones about such matters when in the company of whites was one thing, but actively forgetting such abuses was another. Indeed, early and mid 20th century Black women and men did not forget, much less ignore, interracial sexual violence. In fact, they confronted it in very public ways, in scholarship, in fiction, writing, and plays, and in increasingly well organized and financed legal and political attacks on the racist and sexist foundations of American society. If slavery's lifeblood was a Black woman's physical ability to reproduce children, the segregation of the United States after the war was based on sex, be it the sexual terrorism visited on Black women in their places of employment or the lynching and castration of Black men. See, this is a very interesting way of looking at the civil rights movement, not as Black people just wanting to sit at the lunch counter with white folks or send their kids to integrated schools, but rather the civil rights movement was a protest, a rebellion against the sexual violence that was visited on Black people, which is a very interesting take to give, right? Because if you look at it, much of the violence that was inflicted on Black people in the quote unquote race riots, which were really pogroms, right? That was basically sexual violence. They would come through a town like Rosewood or Black Wall Street, lynch the Black men, cut off their penises, rape Black women, and send them on their way and all this sort of stuff. So yeah, I guess you could also look at the civil rights movement as a rebellion against the sexual terrorism against Black folks. Continuing here. During the years that former slaves provided WPA interviewers with their reminiscences about slavery and slave breeding, African Americans stood on the verge of both challenging and changing America's racial landscape. In an era defined by Jim Crow segregation, the sexual assault of Black women, the terror of lynching, and the anxieties associated with an unprecedented economic depression, Black Americans were on the move. This movement was literal, metaphorical, and political in nature. African Americans migrated out of the South in the tens of thousands, heading primarily to the North in search of employment and sanctuary from Southern racism. Black workers, shunned by white labor unions, formed their own organizations and pursued better work conditions and pay. A growing Black middle class joined the Urban League and the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People and fought against segregation, interracial rape, and lynch mobs by bringing their cause into American courts and the halls of political power. And Marcus Garvey's United Negro Improvement Association both inspired and divided Black Americans on how best to oppose American racism and assert their pride in being the sons and daughters of African ancestors. In the decades prior to the second Brown v. Board of Education 1955 decision, which decreed an end to educational segregation with all deliberate speed, and Rosa Parks' now iconic and mythologized decision to sit defiantly in the white section of a Montgomery, Alabama bus, African Americans engaged with the memory and legacy of racial violence and sexual assault in ways that shaped the rhetoric, politics, and protests of the civil rights movement during the 1950s and 60s. This chapter considers how the public narration and politicization of these memories were woven into civil rights discourse between World War II and the concluding years of the 1960s. Prominent civil rights leaders, such as the most prominent of them all, Martin Luther King Jr., viewed slavery's most intimate abuses as part of the lived reality of Black America's intellectual, cultural, and political history. In publicly addressing this history, Black men, women, and children strove to force Americans to confront the darkest aspects of its past so that it might change the Republic's future course. Very interesting that he brought up Martin Luther King and implied that the sexual abuse that was visited upon Black people was also a part of the very frontal lobe like memory of Black Americans and how we think about our place in society and in this world, right? I mean, any, Black person that really, sits down and thinks about the mass rape that happened to our people and how that changed our phenotypes, how that changed our souls, our spirits, how that changed how we even view ourselves, does probably play a very important part in forming the identity of the South, of the Black man or woman in America and in the world, especially if you're from the diaspora. Let's continue here. Sex, slavery, and the civil rights movement. At the end of World War II, the Social Science Institute at Fisk University declared that one of the most important race relations jobs of the next 10 years will be the full integration of minority group veterans into a post-war world. During the next 2 decades, the members of African American institutions of higher learning, Black churches, and grassroots political organizations took up the cause of full integration for World War II veterans and all African Americans. Mary McLeod Bethune exemplified the drive for full integration when she called on civil rights activists to come together and keep their rendezvous with life. This rendezvous, Bethune believed, would result in African Americans enjoying the rich fruits of democracy. For the vast majority of Black America's civic, religious, and intellectual leaders, the fight for legal equality was a way to attack the historical legacy of slavery and to challenge the nation to live up to its founding ideals. Black churches throughout the South played a critical organizational role in addressing the historical legacy of slavery. While Black intellectuals analyzed the historical and sociological significance of slavery, Black churches provided a focal point for community organizing and political activism. According to E. Franklin Frazier, the Black church had been an organizational hub in successfully destroying slavery, and it played a similarly prominent role once Black America mobilized en masse to fight for racial justice after World War II. For the people drawn to Black churches, the memory of slavery punctuated the rhetoric of their leaders and inspired the activism of the civil rights movement. Charlene Hunter Galt, for example, recalled, "We could see that past, the slavery, the segregation, the deprivation, and denial, for what it was, a system designed to keep us in our place and convince us somehow that it was our fault as well as our destiny. It was time for the nation to confront its history and fulfill its promise of legal equality for all Americans." Very interestingly, Acti and I recently reviewed the film Nickel Boys, right? And in the film, like in almost every film that deals with, the past of segregation and what it was like, right? We had a mini debate within the review about, was segregation actually good for Black folks, right? Because in the film, they showed these boys going to an all-Black high school. And in that high school, the teacher really cared about the students and was trying to push a non-whitewashed version of American history onto the kids and stuff like that. And so Acti brought up the point, fairly, right, that maybe integration could be a bit better, right, for Black people, right? But we don't need integration for us to have, solid American history that doesn't, erase Black people, Native people, Hispanics, etc., from our narrative and our story. And secondly, we, don't need to separate ourselves in society for the very fact we all have to live in this society and contribute to its infrastructure and function. If my Black ass tax dollars go to the white school down the street, then goddamn it, my kids deserve to go to that school. Period. Full stop. Right. So there's that. And thirdly, I'm forgetting what point I'm on exactly, but thirdly, you don't need once again an all-Black school or a segregated society for us to have Black history facts taught. In fact, as I remember going to integrated schools all of my life, Black History Month was celebrated and pushed by my white teachers. I had Black female teachers and Black male teachers all through elementary school, middle school, and high school. But my white teachers were equally teaching us about Frederick Douglass and Martin Luther King, maybe not Malcolm X and stuff like that, but it was still there and the option was there, the books were there, everything was there. Now we're living in America and in a world that is becoming increasingly anti-Black, where attacks on Black History Month and DEI are becoming blatant and out in the open. So once again, I think it's good for us to remember the civil rights movement and not just say that the March on Washington was a farce like you hear in a Public Enemy song, or us just to disregard Martin Luther King as some pie in the sky hippie idealist, right? We need to remember that the idea is that unfortunately we have to live in this world together regardless. right? And if we are going to live in the nation state, if we really do validate the country, the nation state, as the way we want to organize society, then we can have multiracial, multi-ethnic societies, because our world is multi-ethnic and multiracial, right? I'm just going to continue here. The imaginary popularly associated, sorry, the imagery popularly associated with the civil rights movement during the 1950s and 60s is of charismatic leaders, black men and church ministers leading teenagers, college students, and working class people in protest against racial segregation. Leaders such as Martin Luther King Jr. helped to situate the civil rights movement in historical context and deserve their place in the pantheon of influential Americans. King understood that to change America's discriminatory laws and racist institutional practices, historical, Christian, and sociological narratives must inspire grassroots campaigns and high-profile state and national political battles. These efforts took shape during the 1930s and 40s as Black women activists attacked the sexual foundations of segregations, that is, interracial rape and lynching, and African American civic and labor organizations launched assaults on economic and educational discrimination. During World War II, for example, African American leaders A. Philip Randolph, Bayard Rustin, and A.J. Musty, Musty is such a funny name, threatened to protest racial discrimination in war industries by marching on Washington in 1941. Most famously during this period, the Pittsburgh Courier began a campaign promoting the Double V campaign, the fight to end fascism abroad and destroy racial segregation at home. At home. Sorry, I just got a text, thought it might be from work. This spirit of resistance touched most segments of African American society. It especially inspired Black soldiers returning from service in World War II to fight against Jim Crow segregation. The scene was set for what became known as the Civil Rights Movement. By the way, we reviewed the film Rustin starring Coleman Domingo, and that scene of A. Philip Randolph, Bayard Rustin, and A.J. Musty talking about marching on Washington, that was in the film. So go check out our review of the film Rustin. You can find it on the channel. I think it's episode number 80 or something like that. And go watch the film as well. It's actually pretty good. Let's continue here. As the civil rights movement gathered momentum, Black Americans never lost sight of the historical backdrop they operated against. The history of slavery and segregation, with the violence and sexual abuses they helped to perpetuate, inspired nonviolent direct action. Robert H. Walkup, a Black Presbyterian pastor and civil rights leader, delivered a fiery sermon in 1962 in which he addressed the historical motives behind the civil rights movement. Walkup preached that there was more to slavery than we remember. Slavery involved more than magnolias and the mint juleps. Indeed, there was more to slavery than the happy, carefree people, more to slavery than the nice aspects of old massa and old misses that we like to talk about. According to Walkup, slavery was both vile and violent. He thundered, there were people being put through the ringer so severe that they cried out, nobody knows the trouble I've seen. Nobody knows but Jesus. There were people being put through the ringer so severe that they cried out for a chariot to swing low and take them away from it. I mean, those are references to very, famous, important Black, spirituals, gospel songs, stuff like that. Nobody knows the trouble I've seen, swing low, sweet chariot, all that stuff. I mean, when you think about it, man, the great American art forms all derive from the pain of slavery. They all derive from the pain of an entire people, 400 years of oppression. And then you get rock and roll, the blues, hip hop, and pop music. Let's continue, man. Walkup was educated at the University of Mississippi and the Louisville Seminary. He served as a pastor in Mississippi, Texas, and Arkansas in the 1950s and early 1960s. While a pastor at Mississippi State University, Walkup maintained that slavery was sin. But it was more than this. In one short, explosive paragraph in his 1962 sermon, Walkup articulated his suspicion that while slavery was sin, It must surely have been more violent, exploitative, and unjust than they could all remember. Slavery was about how black life and death were determined by the ungodly power of the slave master. The rhetorical combination of life and death in African American narratives of slavery was not new. What was significant in the context of the civil rights movement was the way Walkup's evocative imagery reminded his audience of the historical depth and thus significance of the civil rights movement. Civil rights activists were both engaging with history and changing its course in the same narrative breath. If a sermon about the sin of slavery evoked deeply felt emotions about the past, then language that emphasized the sexual exploitation of the enslaved, especially women, provided a discursive opening for sweeping statements about interracial sexual violence, African American gender relations, and family formation. References to violence, sex, and slavery during the civil rights movement were woven into narratives about the historical injustices that the civil rights movement opposed. The discourses of history and politics, the past and the present, were thus being used to inspire activists for the campaign ahead, justifying the use of nonviolent direct action in the struggle for racial justice. Bayard Rustin connected slavery with the cause of the civil rights movement. Slavery was maintained by violence, he argued, and after slavery, segregation and racial oppression were maintained by violence, threatened and actual. In Rustin's mind, no tactic exposed the contradiction between the United States' historical oppression of Black people and the Republic's professed ideals of freedom and equality better than nonviolent direct action. Rustin was one of the civil rights movement's great thinkers and organizers. Rustin was born in Westchester, Pennsylvania in 1912. From his grandmother, he was introduced to the ideals of pacifism, a philosophy that shaped his future thinking and political activism. He spent much of the civil rights movement in the background, in the shadows, as some historians put it, because of his membership in the Communist Party prior to World War II and his homosexuality. His influence over the tactics and rhetoric of the movement, however, is undeniable. To Rustin, the memory of slavery represented a history of oppression that connected Black Americans of the 20th century to the slaves of the previous 2 centuries. Where the slave plantation once existed as a prison without walls, Rustin asserted that the 20th century penal system took its place and had become a forced labor camp. Rustin also saw historical connections between slavery, segregation, and war, arguing that segregation in any part of the body politic is an act of slavery and an act of war. According to Rustin, segregation was as oppressive as slavery and as violent as war. For 2 centuries, he insisted, Black families have been denied human status in order to safeguard the property rights and breeding prerogatives of slave owners. As Rustin saw things, the only solution to such deeply rooted racial injustices and sexual violence was civil disobedience. By the way, I got to say this, I just got to come up, right? So Rustin is like the brainchild, the man who really pushed forward, the pacifism, right? Because I believe he was a Quaker, right? Growing up in Pennsylvania. I remember that from the movie. And his grandmother taught him about pacifism, right? So I think, how we say in the civil rights movement that Martin Luther King was the guy who came up with nonviolent resistance and he got it from Gandhi, right? We need to start giving it to the Black grandmother who gave the game to Rustin that civil disobedience is the way, one of the avenues we're going to achieve liberation and freedom, right? So give it up to Black Granny. Let's not give it up to Gandhi. Gandhi was an anti-Black racist. We don't give a F about Gandhi. Actually, I'm going to say it right here. Fuck Gandhi. Fuck Mahatma Gandhi. Fuck Gandhi, that anti-Black racist. And we're going to give it up to our Black grandmamas who actually were advocating for civil disobedience and pacifism to fight white supremacy. Gandhi was another brown-skinned Indian man on his hands and knees trying to suck the white man's cock. Fuck Mahatma Gandhi. It's all about Martin Luther King. It's all about Bayard Rustin. And it's all about our Black grandmamas who got the ultimate wisdom, not Gandhi. Fuck Gandhi. Continuing here. And civil disobedience was exactly what the civil rights movement delivered. For the ministers and organizational leaders of the civil rights movement, nonviolent civil disobedience was the ideal antidote to generations of sexual exploitation, violence, and racialized poverty. Martin Luther King Jr. espoused nonviolent civil disobedience as a moral and political tactic for overcoming the legacy of slavery and the crippling effects of segregation. King, who was born on January 15th, 1929, and educated at Morehouse College, Crozer Theological Seminary in Pennsylvania, and Boston University, served, as had his grandfather and father, as at Ebenezer Baptist Church in Atlanta. King's leadership qualities, charisma, and inspiring oratory took him far beyond the pulpit at Ebenezer, however, thrusting him into the national media spotlight. King became the figurehead of the civil rights movement and, in the words of A. Philip Randolph, the moral leader of our nation. King's intellectual development and his rise to national celebrity revealed the central role that slavery played in his understanding of African American history. In 1944, while a junior at Booker T. Washington High School in Atlanta, he won an essay contest with a paper which argued that slavery had been a strange paradox in a nation founded on the principles that all men are created free and equal. As an undergraduate and graduate student, King continued to develop his understanding of slavery in American history. He combined an increasingly sophisticated historical narrative with his maturing views about Christianity, views that emphasize the power of God, the message of love contained in the Bible, and the God ordained, and in King's mind, scientifically proven, unity of mankind. Shout out to Martin Luther King. He doesn't get enough credit for being a sociologist, a historian, a philosopher, and a powerful theologian. Not only that, a powerful political activist and organizer. I mean, he was like 10 powerful Negroes put into one, man. He was 10 powerful Negroes put into one, man. Continuing here. As he emerged as the most influential figure in the civil rights movement during the 1950s, King regularly delivered a speech that emphasized the importance of slavery in African American history. For example, on May 17th, 1956, at the annual dinner of the NAACP's Legal Defense Fund, King spoke about the Atlantic slave trade and the emergence during the 19th century of a pro-slavery lobby in the United States. These pro-slavery advocates, King argued, made the mistake of interpreting the Bible literally, not symbolically. They articulated arguments in favor of a great wrong, chattel slavery. King asserted that under slavery, the Negro mind and soul became enslaved. Even after slavery was abolished, the Jim Crow segregation ushered in a new historical phase of limited freedom for Black Americans. A negative peace between Black and white Americans held sway. King insisted that this negative peace was in need of some positive force for good so that Americans could finally transcend the legacy of slavery. In King's mind, the civil rights movement was thus a Christian mission to right the wrongs of American history. King often spoke about African American history in ways that connected the violence and sexual exploitation experienced during slavery with segregation, interracial rape, and lynching after slavery was abolished. And why we can't wait 1962 King instructed readers that in the days of slavery, the oppression of the Negro was scientifically mandated and enforced by sheer physical force. Reiterating Woodson's thesis in The Miseducation of the Negro, King emphasized the enforced ignorance, social isolation, and physical punishments that enslaved men and women endured. But these were not the worst of slavery's brutalities. King invoked the arguments of Du Bois, Woodson, and Frazier, and echoed the recollections of former slaves to claim fathers and mothers were sold from their children, and children were bargained away from their parents. Young girls were, in many cases, sold to become the breeders of fresh generations of slaves. Imagine Martin Luther King in his big oratory voice talking about breeding, man. That's wild. All right, Jay jumped into the chat. He said, yo, and I'm going to say yo back in the chat. If you got anything to say it in the chat. I'm going to reply. But imagine Martin Luther King. Young girls were bargained away from their parents. Young girls were, in many cases, sold to become the breeders of fresh generations of slaves. I mean, that just sounds epic. Sounds absolutely epic. The slaveholders of America had devised with almost scientific precision their system of keeping the Negro defenseless emotionally and physically. Increasingly, during the late 1950s and into the 1960s, King's speeches and published works expanded on this line of analysis, emphasizing the way slaves have been bred and families unfeelingly torn apart. He regularly channeled Du Bois's arguments about Black women and motherhood, shared Woodson's understanding about the importance of education, and developed his own critique of the Black family. If, as King regularly argued, the Negro is maladjusted, it was the violence and interracial rape associated with slave breeding and Jim Crow segregation, not the African American's racial nature that caused such maladjustment, right? And by the way, Martin Luther King used the term maladjusted to imply that we shouldn't be adjusted to a system that's unjust, if that makes sense, right? Like if something is unjust all around us, we should be sick to our core about that. Like I'm reading his book right now, man. I'm reading this book. This is why I've been riding so hard for Martin Luther King, man. Reading this big book right here, A Testament of Hope, A Testament of Hope, a collection of Martin Luther King's essays and interviews right here. That's why I'm just in love with the brother right now, man, because this is like the first book I'm reading from his words exactly, right? I'm delving deep into his text because I feel like, unfortunately, a lot of Black people who, try to get consciousness. Of course, everybody reads the autobiography of Malcolm X. We all watch Roots. We read various books that are considered canon in Black thought, but Martin Luther King's works are rarely considered canon in like Black thought, at least like, organic streets Black thought. Like if you're just a brother who just loves to get knowledge yourself, you're rarely reading Martin Luther King. And so that's why right now I'm very proud to be picking up this book as well. And that's why I'm just, riding Martin Luther King so hard, because the brother was ill. He was an ill brother. All right, continuing here. King thus viewed the Jim Crow system of segregation that followed slavery as an anemic democracy. He argued that America's anemic democracy kept African American people defenseless emotionally and physically, and exposed fresh generations of Black mothers, fathers, and their family members to the types of physical and psychological violence that their ancestors suffered in slavery. Listing the components that Black Americans so often linked to breeding schemes during slavery, King once stated that through forced separation from our African culture, through slavery, poverty, and deprivation, many Black men lost self-respect. The civil rights movement was, in King's mind, a historic fight for social justice that touched individuals, families, and communities who lived with the memory of slavery and the reality of segregation. In a sense, the civil rights movement represented an attempt by Black men and women to take back and assert the self-respect that had been stolen from their ancestors during the slave breeding decades of 19th century slavery. Black Americans and their white allies made such action possible. Freedom, King thundered in words that echoed the great Black abolitionist Frederick Douglass, is not free. It is always purchased with the high price of sacrifice and suffering. King's commentary on slavery and segregation, racism and sexual exploitation highlighted the historical burdens that Black Americans, especially Black women, lived with. Interracial sex in America had long run a moral gamut, from tragic love to brutal rape, as Daniel McGuire had observed. King understood this, recognizing that when Black women and men spoke about the horrors of slavery, they were often referring to the violence and rape associated with breeding on the slave plantation. To make this point, King used a narrative device that 19th century abolitionists exploited in their struggle to end slavery. It was also a rhetorical tool used by Black playwrights, scholars, and former slaves during the late 19th and early 20th centuries. In King's rendering of American history, African American women were the literal and metaphorical representatives of the race, beaten and exploited, but defiant and determined to overcome the historical legacies of slavery and segregation. During slavery, Black mothers and their children were sexually exploited, violently managed, and sold apart. During the height of the Montgomery bus boycott, Black mothers and their children were still enduring indignities of a similar stripe, albeit ones specific to the age in which they lived. As King reflected, one Negro mother with two small children in her arms put them on the front seat while she opened her purse for her fare. The driver ordered her to take the children from the seat and, without giving her the chance to place the children elsewhere, lunged the vehicle forward, causing the small children to be thrown into the aisle of the bus. What a sick person, man. What a sick person. So this bus driver had this Black woman coming into the bus. She was going to sit in the back, of course. And what did he do? He said, take those Negro children off that front seat, put your money in the toll, and get to the back of the bus. So this lady takes her kids off the seat, and then this bus driver presses his, foot on the gas and makes the kids fall over. What a dickhead. How evil, man. Anyway, continuing here. For prominent civil rights leaders like Martin Luther King, the fight for civil and voting rights was more than a struggle for legal and political equality. It was a mission to insist that the dignity of this mother and her two children be respected and to redeem the soul of a race and of the nation. King believed that this redemption process, like American history, would unfold in stages. Enslavement, the first phase of African American history, according to King, was followed by the second stage, emancipation. However, King cautioned that Black history had not unfolded in an upward evolutionary trajectory. Segregation, for instance, undermined emancipation and was at bottom nothing but slavery covered up with certain niceties of complexity. This was a nagging injustice that African Americans now rose up as one to fight against. King maintained that Black Americans refused to be exploited in a very inhumane fashion, as their ancestors in slavery and segregation had been exploited. So basically, what Martin Luther King is saying here is like, you know, we're not moving forward, right? It wasn't like slavery was bad and then there's progress, but we have Jim Crow, right? And then there's progress afterwards. It was like after slavery, Jim Crow was just as bad as slavery, right? And so, we haven't really made progress. We've only made progress since the formal, really, abolition of Jim Crow, right? Until then, we were technically all enslaved. And in the system of capitalism, it could be argued that we're all exploited and enslaved to some degree. King's combination of historically calibrated language and biblical allegories helped him to contextualize the civil rights movement's place in America's moral and political history. This powerful rhetorical combination had a long tradition among Black preachers of all Christian denominations. King used the symbolic power of the Bible stories to focus movement participants on the goal of fulfilling the promise of the third stage of Black America's history. In a reference to Exodus, for instance, King explained that we are all familiar with the historical circumstances and the psychological conditions that gave many Negroes a sense of inferiority. From antebellum slavery to Jim Crow segregation, the latter being a new form of slavery, King urged Black Americans to join him in championing the cause of legal equality and social justice. As King was wont to emphasize, African Americans were part of a worldwide struggle for freedom in which millions of the world's historically oppressed people of color were using nonviolent direct action to overcome the historical legacy of slavery, sexual exploitation, and socioeconomic discrimination. In King's words, the great challenge facing America at this hour is to bring into full realization the ideals and principles of this third period. King's rhetoric resonated with scores of civil rights leaders and activists. Overcoming the legacy of slavery and segregation was a moral issue. This was certainly the view of James Farmer, a young civil rights activist who shared with Rustin and King a commitment to pacifism. Speaking before members of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee in 1960, Farmer emphasized the magnitude of the task confronting the civil rights movement. He did this by combining historical and biblical language. The Christian favors the breaking down of racial barriers, Farmer intoned, because the redeemed community of which he is already a citizen recognizes no barriers dividing humanity. Not all African Americans believed that nonviolence was the best approach to achieving civil rights reform. Malcolm X, the charismatic Black Muslim leader immortalized in Spike Lee's movie Malcolm X, often used threats of violence in his attacks on the historical legacies of slavery. Malcolm observed that white men and women oversaw slavery's operations, perpetuated its legacies, and divided Black families and communities. In his autobiography, he spoke about the hypocrisy of white America's sexual morality and the ways in which the sexual exploitation of Black women fostered in African American communities a healthy disrespect for white America. According to Malcolm, then, slavery, suffering, and death were the defining features of Black American history. Malcolm X is often remembered for rhetoric that inspired Black Americans and frightened whites. His musings on the ballot or the bullet and his unapologetic insistence that Black Americans must claim their freedom by any means necessary was language that divided Americans along racial and class lines. The NAACP's Robert Williams, a militant civil rights leader, argued that racial violence had conditioned American society to undertake change when, and only when, it encountered force. Williams contended that our people had dreamed and prayed for a peaceful transition from slavery to first-class citizenship and human dignity. This dream failed the slaves and their descendants. It was time, Williams instructed, to consider more forceful methods. Hand grenades, bazookas, light mortars, rocket launchers, and machine guns. Proposing the use of machine guns and rocket launchers went against the grain of civil rights rhetoric. In fact, it undermines the moral tone that movement leaders tried to set and compromise the quest for the creation of a beloved community in place of a nation deformed by the horrors of slavery and segregation. No group of civil rights activists understood this more clearly than African American women. Black women confronted prejudice on two fronts during the 1950s and 60s. They endured male chauvinism from Black and white men and racism. The combined force of male chauvinism and racism were not new to Black women. As we have seen, African American women confronted chauvinism and racism in slavery and in what passed for freedom after the Civil War. Cynthia Griggs Fleming has commented on the qualities that Black women cultivated over the centuries because of this history. She wrote, "Strength and self-reliance have been part of the Black female role and persona for generations, stretching all the way back into slavery." Joyce Ladner, an active member of SNCC, held similar views. Ladner recalled growing up with strong female role models. Her mother was a particular source of strength and inspiration. Mother never heard of Harriet Tubman, Sojourner Truth. Mother was one of 11 children. Mother went through third grade. But Mother also inherited the tradition that a Sojourner Truth or a Harriet Tubman set before her. As Ladner recalled of her mother, African American women lived American history. Because of intergenerational violence, sexual abuse, and racially structured economic systems that put enormous strain on Black families, the legacy of slavery was not something that one necessarily read about in textbooks, but was part of everyday life. One of the ways in which Black women lived with the overlapping histories of racism and chauvinism was in the tensions between men and women over leadership during the Civil Rights Movement. Long marginalized from positions of leadership in Black churches, institutions, and the intelligentsia, Black women nonetheless joined with Black men to fight for the overthrow of Jim Crow segregation. Kathleen Cleaver, who became one of the few African American women leaders in the Black Panther Party, recalled that we young women and young men who flocked to the front lines of the war against segregation were contesting the remaining legacy of racial slavery. What we sought to eliminate, Cleaver elaborated, were the legal, social, and psychological, economic, and political limitations still being imposed on our human rights and our rights as citizens. Shout out to Kathleen Cleaver. There's a great documentary that The Guardian put out. I don't know if it was The Guardian or The Independent. On their YouTube channel, they interview Fred Hampton Jr. and the daughter of Kathleen Cleaver about what it was like to grow up in the Black Panther Party. So go check out that video if you haven't seen it. Black women like Cleaver pursued these goals in a sometimes uneasy coalition with Black men. They also campaigned for the overthrow of the last vestiges of racial slavery by forming their own social and political organizations. This latter point has prompted some scholars to argue that African American women have a history of their own. However, such analysis understates the significant ways in which the histories of race, sex, and gender have intersected in the lives of Black women. As one Black feminist scholar has recently observed, racial solidarity and race liberation have been and remain a fundamental concern for Black Americans. Historically and currently, slavery, segregation, and institutional as well as individual discrimination have been formative experiences in most Black socialization and political outlook. Facts. Continuing here. Sex, violence, and family. Black women shouldered a great many of the burdens of sexual exploitation, marriage breakups, and family separation rooted in the slave breeding schemes of antebellum slavery. For many of the African American women who played an active part in the civil rights movement, childhood history lessons about slavery in the early days of Jim Crow segregation were powerful influences in the desire to correct the wrongs of American history. Black women such as the beautician Vera Piggy, Ella Baker, who tied her political activism to the history of slavery, and Septima Clark, whose mother worked as a washerwoman and whose father had been a slave, all recalled the family stories about slavery that shaped their sense of racial justice and understanding of injustice. Thus, Black children were directly exposed to oral traditions and history lessons from family members and their predominantly female school teachers. There existed no magnolias and mint juleps in the history lessons of early 20th century Black schools. Instead, lessons that emphasized the ideals of racial uplift were mixed with narratives about slave owners and slave traders who exploited enslaved women and shattered Black families to increase their profits. One former student of the African American teacher, One former student of the African American teacher and civil rights activist Septima Clark recalled how Clark balanced lessons about the Revolutionary War, the Civil War, and how people made money during slavery, with lessons about how strong our ancestors back in slavery were, what fine people they were. Some African American parents felt so strongly about their children receiving this type of education that even if segregation had not prevented Black children from enrolling in white institutions, they would still have sought out Black female teachers. This was the case of Ruby Middleton Forsyth, who recalled that her parents refused to let their child receive discipline from a white teacher because that was too much like slavery. Those are good parents. I remember going to school and seeing white teachers paddle Black children in front of all of us, man, in front of all of us. Horrible. The legacy of slavery and the burdens this legacy carried with it weighed heavily on African American girls as they grew into teenagers, womanhood, and ultimately joined the civil rights movement. Actively participating in the movement carried its own economic and cultural challenges for Black women. One former activist articulated these challenges when she recalled that Black female leaders, many of whom were public school teachers, were constrained by family roles and more so by their jobs, where male supervisors looked disapprovingly at any political activity. Within the civil rights movement, male leaders sometimes expressed disdain for Black women who maneuvered themselves into positions of leadership. A former staff member of King's Southern Christian Leadership Conference recalled that many leaders, such as Ralph Abernathy, questioned the value of having women in the organization. According to the former staffer, Black men just thought that women were sex symbols and had no contributions to make. These chauvinistic views were at odds with the public persona that Abernathy and other male leaders cultivated during the civil rights movement. After all, African American men insisted Black men and women had suffered centuries of discrimination together. For instance, they struggled against enormous odds to maintain the bonds of family during and after slavery. In a 1964 speech, Abernathy expressed his own views on slavery, instructing his audience, even when they, slaves, were sold down the river to the highest bidder, husbands separated from their wives, fathers from their sons, and mothers from their daughters, they could envision a reunion in a land just beyond the river where the wicked will cease from troubling, from the weary will be at rest. Despite slavery and practices that African Americans associated with breeding on Southern plantations, Black Americans remained focused on the emotional and material comfort that family had the potential to provide. The fight for political rights and legal equality was, according to Abernathy, tied to that history. Less than a year after Abernathy made these remarks about the Black family, Daniel Patrick Moynihan's The Negro Family, The Case for National Action, 1965, was published. Moynihan's analysis built on the insights of E. Franklin Frazier in the way he emphasized how women headed an overwhelming number of African American families. This was not a particularly original insight. What stirred so much controversy was Moynihan's characterization of female-headed families as victims of a tangle of pathology. The Moynihan Report, as this study came to be known, sparked intense debate within Black America. Critics labeled the report racist, sexist, and classist. By suggesting that white middle-class ideals of family were normal, African American critics, especially women, countered that the report's author had demonstrated a profound insensitivity to the historical conditions that African American families encountered. Critics argue that Moynihan's focus on the systematic weakening of the Black male and his negative portrayal of the matriarchal Black family fueled racist stereotypes. However, it is important to remember that Moynihan's report was true to his liberal politics and intellectual determination to understand the historical and sociological structures that produce socioeconomic dislocation in Black families. Indeed, it was an endeavor that received the approval of civil rights leaders such as Martin Luther King Jr., A. Philip Randolph, Whitney Young, and Roy Wilkins. For Black women who had been at the forefront of the civil rights movement, the Moynihan Report went against their memories of strong, supportive mothers and loving homes. There was no pathology here, but if pathology did exist, it originated in slavery and was perpetuated by Jim Crow segregation. So, I mean, just to break it down for anybody that finds that hard to follow, the Moynihan Report was written by who I remember to be a white man. And the white man basically said, like, yeah, the dysfunction in the Black community comes from the weakened Black male who is not in the household, and all these single mothers essentially are running these households, right? And, this is a debate that still rages on today, the lack of Black male role models and Black fathers in the home and stuff like that, right? Even though it's not true, right? Like, of course, the highest rate of single motherhood is Black women, but single motherhood is counted as a woman and a man having a child, but them not being married. That doesn't mean that they're not boyfriend and girlfriend, that they don't cohabitate together, or that they don't have blended families, right? We just look at single motherhood through the paradigm of marriage, because that is the only quantifiable way to validate a relationship in this patriarchal system that we live in this capitalistic system that we live in, right? But Black men are the most in their children's lives in America, at least. Black men, even if they have children with multiple women, are the ones most likely to still pay their child support and the ones to be in their kids' lives and involved with them, right? No other group of men can say that. Anyway, continuing here. The publication of the Moynihan Report coincided with the passage of the Civil Rights and Voting Rights Act in 1964 and 65. With these significant goals achieved, the leadership of the civil rights movement sought a renewed sense of purpose. Martin Luther King Jr. tried to provide this direction by emphasizing the need to address Black poverty. Black nationalists, on the one hand, espouse variants on Marxist theory and chauvinistic nationalist ideologies. A younger generation of Black men, such as Huey Newton, Eldridge Cleaver, and Leroy Jones, Amiri Baraka, played prominent roles in organizations perceived by the mainstream media as racially militant. Newton, Cleaver, Baraka, and the young Black men who joined organizations such as the Black Panther Party or Ron Karenga's Us seized on the Moynihan Report to voice an intense misogyny and accuse Black women of being unfeminine and castrating their men and sons. As historian Deborah Gray White has observed, Black nationalists viewed the Moynihan Report as an example of the unnaturally strong and emasculating qualities of Black women. Right? The Moynihan Report did more destruction to the Black community than the film Scarface. I swear, because gosh, like I cannot think of one debate that bothers me more than Black men saying Black women are ratchet, Black women are loud, ghetto, aggressive, unfeminine. Nothing bothers me more than that because nothing makes it so untrue. It's absolutely untrue that Black women are not feminine